Welcome to Dig Deeper, Season 2, Episode 3. I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Stephen Backhouse. Stephen, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, man. I'm good.
You're having a good day writing, I understand, today?
I've been writing today. I've been also mentally getting ready. I'm teaching tomorrow. I'm doing another online class tomorrow for an outfit in Cambridge. So
amazing.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. I had a really disastrous online teaching last week, a couple of weeks ago. It's like, I've been doing Zoom teaching now for over a year, and last week was my worst one ever. It was just
Tell it. You can't just leave it there. I want to know, what was it? Just bad because you felt it went bad, or were there some like
bad because there was so many things, but like the technical problem as I was trying to share my screen, and you actually, how you can like move between two screens, and I accidentally got into the thing where the Zoom call was on one screen, but all my notes for the talk were on another one, and so I actually couldn't figure it out in the moment. So I had to just look at my notes. So that meant I spent an hour just talking to my own laptop. I couldn't see anybody. And then I did my thing the best I could. And then I switched back, for any questions, and I switched back to the Zoom for the discussion, and there were no questions and nobody wanted to discuss anything. So you just sit there like a numpty. And they were, it was just terrible. And then, apparently people liked it. I got some emails afterwards, but in the moment, nobody responded at all. I got zero feedback. Like, I didn't get any feedback from anybody. It was just like talking into the void.
Oh my goodness.
It was awful.
Tomorrow will be better.
Yeah, tomorrow will be better. No notes, no PowerPoint.
Here we are. We're in Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount in this season 2 of Dig Deeper. And the passage we got in front of us today is Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 17. So if you've got it in front of you, then do feel free to look it up. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, all the way through to verse 26. So I'm going to read it for us. If you, by the way, hear some cheers in the background, that's because just down the road is a pub filled with football fans of one kind or another. So You'll know if there's a goal scored by the soundtrack behind me. But
also, can you hear my chair squeaking as well? My chair squeaks quite badly. It sounds.
I can hear it a little.
It sounds like I'm making a bottom noise, but it's not. It's my chair.
Well, on that. A high
witty repartee.
Yeah, exactly. Verse 17, Jesus speaking. This is from N.T. Wright's New Testament translation. Don't suppose that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy them. I came to fulfill them. I'm telling you the truth. Until heaven and earth disappear, not one stroke, not one dot is going to disappear from the law until it's all come true. So anyone who relaxes a single one of these commandments, even the little ones, and teaches that to people will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Yes, let me tell you, unless your covenant behavior is far superior to that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. You heard that it was said to the ancient people, you shall not murder, and anyone who commits murder shall be liable to judgment. But I tell you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Anyone who uses foul and abusive language will be liable to the law court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be liable to the fires of Gehenna. So if you're coming to the altar with your gift and you remember that your brother has a grievance against you, leave your gift right there in front of the altar and go first and be reconciled to your brother. Then come back and offer your gift. Make friends with your opponent quickly while you are with him in the street, in case your opponent hands you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you find yourself being thrown into jail. I'm telling you the truth. You won't get out until you've paid every last copper coin.
Okay. So what did you preach on? You said you preached on this.
I did. I mean, it was a whistle stop tour of the two sections. You know, there's two very clear sections here. You know,
Yes.
no matter how it's subtitled, otherwise, there are these two sections. And
Yeah.
I think the thing I liked about it is that the first section about the law and Jesus' role in fulfilling it, not abolishing it, kind of sets up the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, or at least the next kind of section, because it's like the other parts that follow are like case studies of how this works in practice.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. This is like the agenda or the lens that's going to help you read the rest of it.
Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed speaking about the first section, the kind of the fulfilling the law, because I think there's what I wanted to speak into was this kind of tendency, particularly in kind of popular Christian culture, to be people that like the words of Jesus but don't really kind of pay much attention to the rest. And you know, there's a lot of kind of red letter Christians out there that kind of, oh well, I don't really pay attention to the Old Testament. I don't really like that. The God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New.
Right. Right.
And I think what I like about it is that Jesus very clearly affirms and upholds the Old Testament, or certainly the law and the prophets as it's described here. And so if we're going to take Jesus seriously, as lots of people want to do, then you kind of also need to take the rest of it seriously as well. So I really like like what that said about, you know, the law that Jesus kind of spoke into, but also that he doesn't just take it at face value, but then as the case study in anger that I looked at then in the second part of my talk, this, you know, he isn't throwing out the law. He says, I'm bringing to completion. It's like there's a kind of eschatological element to which he's saying the whole of human history is being fulfilled in me.
Right.
As revealed in these ancient scriptures. But I have come to fulfill it, but it's not as you might think.
Well, exactly. So I was going to say, like, when he says, oh, I'm not going to change the law in one iota, and then the very next breath he goes, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you.
Yeah.
So how did you, I mean, you said he very clearly affirms all the law and the prophets, and I don't think that's a true sentence. I don't think he clearly does anything of that sort.
Okay. Well, it feels like it's like he's in an environment where he's already been, I mean, it's inference, but where he's already being accused of essentially kind of throwing out
the
Old Testament. You know, he's, you know, a good rabbi, and he's trying to say, well, no, I've not come to abolish it, but I have come to fulfill it. I think what he was speaking against is the interpretation that it's ended up as. It's kind of almost the law is this, but you're missing the heart behind it. You know, so when he talks about anger, he's like, you guys are just, you know, being, you know, to coin a term, Pharisaical about the way you're just talking about murder, and as long as you don't murder, then everyone's fine. But he's saying, hang on a minute, there's something dehumanizing about even anger that results in murder, but that dehumanizing process starts with anger. So that's kind of the place I took. It's not that Jesus kind of brings it into
I think we have this idea, it's a false idea, but we have this idea that like the Pharisees were like fundamentalists, and Jesus comes along and he's a liberal and he liberates everybody. And actually it's kind of the opposite, because in the world that they were in, that he was working in, there was a whole sort of welter of extra of commentary and law on top of the Moses canon. And in a way, it was all kind of like, it was very easy to find an exception for yourself from the rule. So, or it would be like a whole big description of what constitutes murder, or what constitutes accidental death, if you kill somebody on this time of the year, it's murder, but if you do it a different time of year, it's whatever. Like there's a whole kind of like, it was really easy to find a place where it was an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
And this is going to come out really clearly with divorce as well. So actually, if anything, it was a little bit more that Pharisees, or the Pharisaical world, that was focused on always talking about the law, was kind of quote unquote liberal.
Yeah.
Because they were always able to say, well, the age where we're at now, like I know that's what happened then, but here we are right now. So what is the spirit of the age telling us right now?
Yeah.
Are we exempt from the law? And to hear Jesus speak, I think was more like hearing somebody saying, I know what it was like. Let me tell you how it was meant to be at the beginning, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So rather than saying, well, I'm the latest word on the law, he's saying I was the first word of the law, which is not that's not a way that Pharisees would normally act around the law.
Yeah.
So but it isn't a straightforward. I would want to put some brakes on some of what you were saying there, because it isn't a straightforward endorsement though either of the law, because in fact it's quite a radical. It's not. He really does kind of radically reinterpret or reframe some stuff that we would find it, and it's not just when he says like, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you, he's not just referring to some of that extra stuff. I mean, he's referring to stuff in Deuteronomy, in Exodus, where when you read the scriptures, it's like, and God said, ... And Jesus comes along, he says, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you. So he is actually challenging. It's not just the sort of extra fluff that's accreted itself around the law. He is actually addressing some pretty core stuff there.
Yeah.
But he always does it not by saying, oh, it's not relevant to you anymore. He's like, it's even more relevant than you thought. It's even more super relevant to, like you said, to the heart of it. He goes straight to the heart. Yeah.
And even to some degree, he's more extreme. He pushes it even further,
Oh, what, much further, yeah.
And so I kind of close my time on Sunday by saying, well, let's look at actually, for those of us that think the words of Jesus are always nice and lovey-dovey and fluffy and make us feel good, it's like, let's just actually look at the words of Jesus here and says, right, so those of us who have, treat someone with contempt, and those of us who say you fool, you are not worthy of the purposes of God, essentially, you are, there's a place called Gehenna for you. That they're like strict.
Yeah. The stakes are high. Yeah, for sure. He's not a kind of everyone just look in your inner heart and everyone just do what's right for them.
Yeah.
All paths lead to one God. He doesn't actually, that's not the kind of tone he's taking, and he doesn't sound like that. I don't think he doesn't feel like that to be around Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not a street corner fundamentalist preacher either, but he really is saying like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Yeah. And even in these, that's actually a good way to sum up even what we've just read about the law. Another way to say it would be the way the Gospel of John says it, which is, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Okay.
Because even here he's saying, like, when he says, I haven't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it, what he means is like, I'm fulfilling the law. He doesn't mean I'm going to follow the book really well, right? So he doesn't say, don't think I've come to abolish the law, but to obey it. He's not saying that. He's saying, don't think that I have come to abolish the law. I have come to be the thing that the law was pointing towards.
Yes. Yeah.
So he's making it all about him.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is idolatry. If he's not actually God, that's a really bad thing he's just done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean,
so I wouldn't want to think that in this passage he's shining the light back onto the Hebrew scriptures as if he's saying, don't look at me, just go read Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Because he's not saying that. He's actually saying the opposite.
But what he's doing and what he causes us to do is we need to view those scriptures through the lens of Jesus.
Yeah.
Is that to read the Old Testament without, Scott McKnight does this brilliant thing about how you can read scripture. He talks about how you can read it I'm going to forget them all now, but you can read it devotionally.
Oh yeah, right.
You read it devotionally, canonically, historically, socio-pragmatically. I can't remember all
Right. Yeah.
he talks about all these different ways you read scripture, but essentially his point is, unless you read through the lens of Jesus, unless you're looking through Jesus at those passages,
Yeah.
then you are always going to misread them. It doesn't matter whether you're going to read them historically or canonically or whatever.
Right.
Unless you read through the lens of Jesus, you're missing the point.
That's the theological term, the sort of 100-pound term is Christological hermeneutic. This is the
Yeah.
This is the beginning of the. I think we must have talked about that before, but the Christ lens. You know, the hermeneutic is just your technique for transit. Like what color sunglasses are you wearing when you look at the world?
Yeah.
That's your hermeneutic.
Yeah.
And so here he's like, this is the beginning of this development of like, we're going to interpret everything based on whether Jesus affirmed or didn't affirm it, or whether it's talking about Jesus or not.
Yeah.
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 And that's do you know, I actually had a did I tell you I'm making a series of podcasts with a rabbi right now? Did I ever tell you about that?
No, I didn't know that.
So he actually got in touch with me. We have a mutual friend. He's in Canada, and he was making a podcast about, like, he said, I want to talk with Christian. I want to ask a Christian all the things that Jews want to know, and I want the Christian to ask me anything that they want about Jews. And so he's like a kind of an equivalent of a tent theology, but for Judaism.
Okay.
And he's just working in Montreal. His name is Avi Feingold is his name. And we instantly became friends. It was really fun. We had like an initial meeting and we got along really well. And so now we started to record this podcast, which I think he's going to re-release next week. I'm not sure. He's in charge. But one of the things we're doing is we actually did a little Bible study of this passage.
Okay.
To talk about it. And it was interesting because I read the thing about not one jot or tittle or not one iota will be removed from the law. And he right away, he said, oh, that's a reference to an ancient Jewish story. And he told me this story. Have you heard this before?
No.
I don't have the exact details. This was quite a few months ago that we talked about it, so I'm kind of forgetting it. But he said the story is that there was like two scribes, and they were there's one scribe that was like, he loved the law so much that he would do every letter multiple times, and he would add little curlicues, and he would add like basically calligraphy, right?
Yeah.
And I think there was another scribe that just believed in just the straight letters. And I think the angel of the Lord shows up. I might be getting the story wrong, but it's like the angel of the Lord shows up and he affirms the guy who's adding all his embellishments. And the angel of the Lord says, you know, every jot and tittle, every little curlicue, I affirm that. And the idea is that the scribe loves the law so much that he just wants to linger over it as long as possible. So he spends as much time as he can writing out each letter. Right? And so my friend said, oh yeah, this is like, that's an allusion to that story of how much attention you're paying to the law. It's not so much about the content of it, because like all the little flourishes, they're not adding to it, but they are lingering over it.
Yeah, okay.
And there's so much attention spent on it. So the idea is, it sounds like Jesus is saying, like, I'm the scribe that's spending a lot of time looking really carefully at the law, or really like looking so closely at it, I'm almost going through it to the other side.
Yeah.
It's a good story, right?
Yeah.
The angel of the Lord affirming the scribe who loves scribbling and coloring. It's like a coloring book.
Yeah. So Jesus is obviously pretty strong, isn't he? You know, so anyone who relaxes a single one of these commandments, even the little ones,
yeah,
and teaches that to people, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, and those that does them will be called great.
But note that he's affirmed. What he means is, it's least of the laws that he is now laying out. So he's affirmed. He's just told you, I've fulfilled the law.
Yeah.
So the great and the least are the people who are following Jesus.
Yeah. Okay.
So It's the way Jesus affirms or lays down the law. That's what we now are supposed to. If we have our Christ lens on, our Christ-colored sunglasses, now Jesus is the one who's going to determine what's the least or the greatest.
So every time we almost see the word law, we need to just see Jesus first, don't we?
Yeah.
Kind of make sure that Jesus is the first thing we see when we see the word law.
But while you're right, it shouldn't just be like this kind of, oh, we don't need the Hebrew scriptures anymore. Why it shouldn't be that is that Jesus doesn't make sense unless you have the Hebrew scriptures. Like, his whole conversation is about that. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
So this is where the early Christians totally got this. They were like, yeah, it was actually one of the very first heresies. This is something I talk about with my friends. So do you know Marcionism?
Yeah.
So sort of early on in the church life, I forget exactly when, the first 100 years, within 150 years of the church, there was a theologian preacher guy named Marcion who decided, like, oh, we don't need the Hebrew scriptures at all because we just have Jesus now. And not only that, like, you know, the Jewish faith is all about bodies and land, and it's all very sort of human, and that's not very good. Jesus is all about escaping your body and being, you know, airlifted as a spirit into heaven and all this kind of stuff. And so they basically, the Marcions were like, oh yeah, the Jewish God is a bad God. He made the world, and the world is bad, and we don't need the Hebrew scriptures anymore. And that became one of the first official heresies, right? So the church, in all its wisdom, said, no, calling Jewish scriptures evil is a heresy. Because Jesus was Jewish, and everything he said was from the scriptures, and everything he did was a comment on the scriptures. So, you know, for all that the Christian church is not exactly a shining light when it comes to anti-Semitism, it is interesting that one of the first ever heresies was to say you're not allowed to say that Jews are bad and that the Old Testament is useless.
Yeah. Well, particularly in a modern culture where we increasingly find the Old Testament, you know, unpalatable or whatever. And I think the temptation is, like I said earlier, you know, to just be red letter Christians, or just take the words of Jesus. I can't really cope with whatever in the Old Testament. Yeah. But it's interesting that was the most, that could, you can imagine, you know, that could have been one that, it's interesting that, you know, as Christians, we don't practice the Jewish festivals or rituals or anything like that. So if they had wanted to, they could have easily just said, well, the scriptures aren't for us either. That we don't have it, you know, we don't have any need for them in the same way we don't have any need for all these other things that are Jewish.
Yeah, but we don't. So, I mean, very early on, including within the New Testament itself, Jewish Christians were saying, we don't need to do some of this stuff. We don't need circumcision. We don't need to try and do sacrifices. We don't need to obey feud laws. So very early on, Christians were saying there are parts of the law that are no longer applicable to us anymore. Yeah. And their reasoning was because of this kind of thing. Because they were like, well, because Jesus didn't affirm food and purity laws. He actually declared all things clean. Jesus didn't keep separate from Gentiles. So neither will we, right? So that at every moment when they decided which parts of the law were or were not something that was applicable to them, they were using their Christ lens. They were like, well, did Jesus affirm this? No. Okay, so we don't affirm it either. Yeah. So they weren't anti-law. To just say they got rid of it is too simplistic, but they were definitely reimagining it. Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is that they could have had every reason, if they felt like the Old Testament had, or the Hebrew scriptures were no longer relevant at all. Yeah. Could have had every reason at that point to break with it and just say,
oh yeah, exactly. And they do not do that.
And they don't, which gives you even more reason why.
I don't think there's a single page in any New Testament book that doesn't quote the Hebrew scriptures in some way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. They definitely were not on a campaign to get rid of the Hebrew scriptures. Whatever you want to say about the early church, they definitely weren't trying to get rid of the Hebrew scriptures.
And And indeed, they do quote here. Jesus does. You've heard it said, or
Yeah.
you shall not murder,
Yeah.
and anyone who commits murder shall be liable to judgment. How do we read this passage on anger and murder?
Well, I mean, this is one of those interesting ones. So this is, like I was saying, I think there's quite a lot of noise about what constitutes a murder and what's the difference between killing and murder and self-defense and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
Jesus just sort of cuts through the crap, and he goes straight for, like, well, if you're angry, if you hate somebody, I'm more interested in your heart than in your sort of parsing out all your different actions, right? Like, it's more important that you wanted someone dead than even that you actually killed them or not. Like, that's more important to me.
yeah,
And so this is one of those things where he sort of cuts through all of the legal definitions of murder, and at the same time he makes it sort of, he heightens the importance of it.
yeah.
And then he uses this word, but it's worth looking at the word. What was your translation for the word raka? Verse 22.
Well, in the one I used on Sunday, interestingly, it didn't try and translate it. The Aramaic word.
Yeah.
Um,
What does Tom Wright say?
which verse are we in? Verse.
Whoever says raka to his brother shall be liable.
Oh yeah. Who is angry? Just says who is angry.
Right.
And then it says anyone who uses foul and abusive language. I mean, in the commentaries that I read in preparation for my talk, it talks about, language that shows contempt for somebody
Yes.
else.
Yeah. I felt like Tom Wright was a little bit too general there, too vague.
Yeah, yeah,
Because the word raka, which often doesn't get translated on purpose because it's kind of untranslatable. I think it's an Aramaic word, but it's not so much getting. So I think sometimes people translate it as like "you fool" or "you empty head," but I think this is one of those times when you've got to think about what did it feel like to hear it rather than
yeah,
the literal translation. So it's not like, as long as you never call somebody a fool, you're fine. That's not the point. The
yeah,
point is, like, the word raka was a bit like, well, pardon my French, but it'd be like calling somebody a piece of shit, right? It's like an utter kind of worthlessness. It's like,
yeah,
you mean nothing. Like, you are
yeah,
nothing.
yeah,
And so that's the attitude. It's kind of like, don't emotionally wipe somebody off the face of the earth.
yeah,
That's what Jesus is getting at here. It's like, don't just dismiss somebody completely from your
yeah.
existence.
Well, I think the thing that I was reflecting on it was that when we're angry at somebody and we get caught in that kind of frame of mind, like you said, the kind of the English equivalent of raka, whatever that might be.
Yeah,
What we're doing is we are dehumanizing somebody,
exactly. Yeah.
and that is so that grieves God so much, because if to take away that which is the image of God in somebody else. So the
Yeah.
dehumanize isn't just saying they are no longer human. That would be bad enough, but it's also to deny that which God created. It's to say, God created them, everybody in the image of God, and so to
Yeah.
express that kind of contempt is to take that away from somebody. It's to say they are no longer, as I view them, known, loved, created in the image of God. And that's what I think is why Jesus speaks so strongly about it.
Yeah, you're right. That image of God. I mean, I personally find this really hard because I like so much to just find the one word or the one judgment I can do that just sums up somebody, and then just kind of lay it on them and then get rid of them and never have to think of them ever again. Like, I'd love to do that. And that's totally my temptation, right? Is to find that just the right judgment which sums everything up, and then I get to dismiss you from my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, like, this is Jesus totally telling me not to do that, because it's really addictive. You really love being able to just do a house clearance and get rid of everybody that's bugging you and
Yeah.
say, you're dead to me. That'd be the idea, like, you're dead to me,
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
and then we have that, don't we, in that picture of in the prodigal son. You're dead to me.
right. Yeah, right. That would be the attitude. Um, Also, pay attention to this Gehenna, to the danger of the fires of Gehenna. Did we talk about this last week? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the valley of where all the waste was burned.
Right. And just remember that it's again, I think it has a connotation or a feeling of a place of utter worthlessness, to be utterly worthless. Like, to be thrown into Gehenna just means that your life is utterly worthless, right? And so notice that the pairing here is, don't say to somebody you are utterly worthless, or you yourself will be in the place of utter worthlessness, right?
Yeah.
It's the pairing there.
Yeah.
It's not a lake of eternal fire.
Yeah.
It's the place of utter worthlessness.
But in the passage, we've got two separate things that Jesus warns us about. One is to use contemptible language for somebody, to dismiss them, dehumanize them. But then he also adds in, and for them, the judgment is to go to court.
Yeah.
But then this other thing, and Tom Wright does translate it here, you fool. Anyone who says you fool,
yeah,
will be liable to the fires of Gehenna. And the again, the kind of understanding I got from that is that those that were considered fools were those that had chosen rebellion against God.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
It was less about it's like you are no longer worthy even of God's respect because you yourself have chosen the idiocy of turning against God. And so
right. And so that would be one of these, the measure you use will be the measure used against you, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's this element to which, when we say you fool, it's because we have perceived to somebody in the religious terms anyway that they are in willful rebellion against God. And so we essentially become judge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that the kind of consequence for us as those who judge is to face our own judgment in Gehenna.
Yeah. And also it's one of those things where it's not really like, I think I'd like to get us to stop thinking about it as a punishment in the afterlife. It's not a punishment in the afterlife. It's like Jesus says it later on, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Or the phrase that you're going to lie, if you make your bed, you'll lie in it, right? It's that kind of phrase. So he's not saying like, if you go through life judging people and calling them worthless, then one day when you die, you might find that you yourself are now judged. He's not saying that. What he's saying is, if you go through life putting yourself as a judge and declaring people worthless, you have now created the world in which that is going to happen to you, right? Like, you have removed yourself from that web of relationships where people are together and trying to work together. So you've set yourself apart, and now by setting other people apart, you've set yourself apart, and now you are also the worthless one.
Yeah.
So it's not like this kind of be good so that you don't go to hell. It's don't live a life that is in such a way that it leads to the same judgment that you're putting on will be put back to you, right?
Yeah. So we've had a question come in as we talk right now, which is obviously leads to the question around, when Jesus is talking about Gehenna and judgment and so on.
Is that hell?
Yeah, the whole thing about hell. It's not a particularly popular subject. It's not something that we hear very often, except in maybe certain kind of fire and brimstone kind of contexts.
I mean, some people love it. I mean, I think I've told you before, like Jesus talks about something like hell maybe 8 times in all the Gospels.
Yeah.
He talks about the kingdom 200 times. So
yeah.
But I don't think, well, first of all, I don't think the word hell is the right, I mean, it isn't, he doesn't talk about hell. That's an Anglo-Saxon word, which was applied to, there's multiple different places in the Bible. I think I've told you this before, right? There's Sheol, there's Hades.
Yeah, that's right.
There's all these different places, and they all do slightly different things, right? And there's the pit that's reserved for Satan and all his minions. And all that's happened is the Anglo-Saxon word hell has just been applied to every single one of these different things. And a lot of the time, Jesus is actually talking about the realm of the dead. So Hades, for example, is the realm of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Not the place of punishment, it's the place of the dead. And everybody goes to Hades when they die, according to Greek mythology. And Jesus, so when he comes along and he says to Peter, I'm going to give you the keys to this kingdom, to my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against you. He's talking about the realm of the dead. He's talking about the fear of death. But of course, we Anglo-Saxonized Christians, we go, oh, he's talking about hell.
Yeah.
And there's demons flying around. It's like,
Well,
no, we've got to be careful here.
We have the kind of Victorian picture of.
Yeah, we got to be careful here. And it doesn't mean that you're saying there's no such thing as this. You're just saying, no, we've got to pay attention to what, which is why the responsible translators like Tom Wright and like my guy, Bentley Hart, they don't actually translate the Vale of Gehenna or the Valley of Gehenna. Yeah. They don't call it hell. They leave it as the Valley of Gehenna. Because Jesus isn't talking about a lake of fire with demons poking sinners with pitchforks. He's not talking about that.
Yeah, well, it's in a bit like the Raka being left in there. Actually, sometimes the wisdom is to kind of almost in some ways to make it less easy in terms of our own understanding, so that we actually journey in the translation work of understanding the text, rather than just kind of lazily kind of, oh, we'll write hell here. And everyone just jumps to what they already think.
Like exercise in seeing old things with fresh eyes. Like you need to be reminded that this is not an English word. And it's good to be reminded, yeah.
Yeah.
So but the question did ask, does hell exist, or what is hell? And, I think there's that's a big conversation that people can be having. But it's perfectly legitimate. This is where I'm standing. It's very perfectly legitimate to talk about it in terms of annihilation, or people just getting what they want, right? Rather than eternal conscious torment.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the eternal conscious torment idea is one that has developed through Roman Catholic medievalism.
Yeah.
For reasons outside of the New Testament. Or the Old Testament. The Old Testament certainly doesn't have it, and the New Testament doesn't either.
Yeah.
So, I think we can talk about places of destruction, or places of annihilation, or places of utter worthlessness.
Yeah.
And I think we can talk about hell being situations that we create with our actions. Now, like our organized rebellion against the way of God creates hell.
Yeah. I mean, I generally kind of, when people talk to me, about what I think hell is, I mean, I generally go with, well, let's start with what it's not. It's not where God is.
Yeah.
And so you think, well, what are the things that God gives us? Life, love, relationships, peace, joy, all those things are absent from whatever that might be. Now, that doesn't mean therefore, now, if it's absent of life and God is the source of life, then that would then follow that hell, whatever that is annihilation. It's
So, I mean, Bentley Hart famously wrote a really interesting book called All Shall Be Saved. And I mean, he's uncovered, his argument is that actually the earliest church fathers and stuff, they actually believed in a kind of a universal salvation eventually for everything. He doesn't even like annihilationism. He's gone so far the other way that he says, no, all shall be saved. Everything will be redeemed, and it will go through a time of purification and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might feel like hell to people who are resisting God's love. But, I mean, his book is interesting. It's worth reading because it's rooted in like ancient early church thinking. It's not really based on like modern interpretations of stuff.
Well, a lot of it is looking at Paul's letters in the Romans, for example, and how you in a conversation around Romans 9-11 around what do we think is happening when he talks about salvation, when he talks about Israel, when he talks about what's being caught up in these terms. Well,
back to us here. That's not what Jesus is talking about.
Yeah.
So remember that the Sermon on the Mount is the rule of God for the people of God.
Yeah.
Just like Moses and his 10 commandments and the law is the rule of God for the people of God. Yeah. Now Jesus comes along and says, well, the people of God look slightly different than you thought they looked.
Yeah.
And the rule of God also looks slightly different than you thought it looked.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, like, be with me, do what I do. This is the way to live. And if you don't live this way, it's like you're living outside of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So if the kingdom of heaven is now, well, the kingdom of hell is also now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And here he's giving rules for the kingdom of heaven. He's like, this is what it looks like. And if you don't do it, it's like you're living in the kingdom of hell.
Yeah.
If you want to use Anglo-Saxon words.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I really like about how we read the Sermon on the Mount is what, again, Scott McKnight talks about, like actually the Jesus Creed, the kind of fundamental commandment,
right?
Talking about the commandments is this: love the Lord your God with all your your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the kind of fundamental commandment that we're called to live. And the Sermon on the Mount is the meat on the bones of that. This is how we go about loving God and loving one another.
Yeah.
Is to follow this way of living. So he doesn't just say, "Don't be angry," or
no,
this
yeah.
is what he says, and this is how you go about it. This is what reconciliation looks like. So
yeah, that's really good point. That's a really good point. Yeah, he's not just saying don't. He's saying this is what it looks like to do the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this reconciliation business that he's talking about. Like this thing about if you bring your gift to the altar, right? Like, all right, so the altar is, by the way, the place of forgiveness, right? Like that's just point that out. Like that's the only reason you're at the altar, it's to be forgiven. So it's the business of forgiveness.
Yeah.
So when you bring your gift to the business of forgiveness, now, and then he says, recall that your brother holds something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar and first go and be reconciled, right? We just skate over this so quickly because, like, what do you think have you noticed what's kind of odd about that instruction?
Well, I mean, I made this point on Sunday, is that actually it's the reconciliation begins with the person who feels something has got something against them.
Yeah. It's not when you're standing at the altar and you think of all the things that your brothers have done against you. It's like when you stand at the place of forgiveness, see, the way I naturally want to do, right, is I want to add a list of all the people who have wronged me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I'm going to go through the process of like, okay, I forgive you. I forgive you, George. I forgive you, Tom. I forgive you, Carol. Right? And Jesus isn't saying that. He's not saying make up a list of all the things people have done against you and then forgive them. He's like, really search yourself and think, have you pissed anyone off? Then go and reconcile to that. Like, it's the complete opposite of what I would be tempted to do. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Think, does your brother hold something against you? And then there's this extravagant thing, you're supposed to leave your gift at the altar and go and reconcile. And the idea is here, like, it's one of these exaggerations because you wouldn't leave your gift. Like, it's meant to show you how, what a big deal it must be. He's just saying this is how important reconciliation is. It's a bit like, I was talking to somebody about this. I said, I think it's a bit like when you sit down with your family on Christmas morning and you've got all your gifts in front of you and you're about to unwrap them. And then you realize somebody has something against you. Leave your gifts and leave your family and leave the Christmas tree and go over to that person's house and ask for forgiveness and then come back and open your gifts with your family, right? I think it's kind of feels like hearing him say that.
Yeah. Well, and also there's this, it really does, we talk a lot about being reconciled to God. It's important that we come every week before God and we kind of make our peace, as it were. But what this says is you can't really do that without having been reconciled to others as well. Like it goes back to that passage, think how many times you've been forgiven, and go and offer how you can't receive forgiveness until you yourself have forgiven other people. There is this real mandate to actually for human beings to be sorting their stuff out before they go to God and be at peace with him.
And also the idea is that, when Jesus says in Matthew, like, because later on he's going to say, if you don't, actually even in the sermon, if you don't forgive, then God won't forgive you.
Yeah.
Or later on in Matthew, he'll talk about, like, if you forgive, then they will be forgiven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven.
Yeah.
And I don't think the idea is that, like, I've heard it described as, it's not like this kind of eternal judgment saying, I refuse to forgive you. It's more like well, what does forgiveness look like except when you are reconciled with each other? That is forgiveness. Like God's, so the guy described, he said, like, if you're in a church and you've decided to eject somebody from your church community, and you decided not to forgive them, and they are literally physically outside the door, banging on the door, asking to be let back in, the neighbors will look at you and go, oh, I guess they haven't forgiven that guy, right? It's very sort of physical. But then if you open the door and let him in, then he is forgiven indeed. And it's kind of like, well, that's what forgiveness is. It's not like there's some sort of mystical, magical thing. It's kind of like, well, forgiveness looks like reconciliation between people.
Yeah, okay.
And if you don't do reconciliation between people, then you're not forgiven.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. If you forgive on earth, that's like being forgiven in heaven.
I think one of the challenges with this, isn't it, is that relationships aren't quite as neat and tidy as that. And so reconciliation,
Right.
often there's so much hurt that has gone on between people.
Yeah, right.
Usually kind of made worse by anger. And so you kind of think often you're in you know that there's a brokenness in the relationship and you're thinking, well, they may not want me to come knocking on their door asking for forgiveness even.
Yeah, I know.
Or even to be like, actually, I feel like they've wronged me, but they are pretty stubborn about the fact they don't really admit it and they don't want to admit it. And so I'm like, there's a desire to be reconciled, but how far that can go when it requires both sides, right? It requires both sides.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this is like a kind of it's not an ideal. I don't mean like in an idealistic way, but I mean, he's presenting the carrot, not the stick. He's saying this is how it could look for all of us.
Yeah.
So he's giving the best examples rather than the worst. And so from my point of view, I feel like we could all at one time be the brother who is offended, or the brother who offended others.
Yeah.
So if one day you ring me up out of the blue and you say, Stephen, I wonder whether I need to reconcile with you. Hopefully my imagination is being shaped by the Sermon on the Mount to such an extent that I go, oh crap, it's my turn now to be the one. Like he's chasing after me to be reconciled. So I better start acting like let me recognize what John is trying to do. He's trying to enact the Sermon on the Mount. So I need to be in a position to receive that. And then at another time, it might be me who's knocking on your door and wanting to pursue reconciliation. So hopefully, if our minds are all being shaped by the Sermon on the Mount, we're all going to start to recognize when reconciliation starts to happen around us, and we will participate in it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and in a culture that we live in right now, which is so divided and so polarized, and I mean, I was reading an article. It's actually a Tim Keller article recently. I can't remember the title of it. It's kind of something like the lost art of forgiveness. In that we live in a culture now which is actually more concerned about digging up the past and holding that against people.
Right.
Than it is about showing mercy, grace, forgiveness, and so on. Where I think there's a book called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" by John Ronson.
John Ronson, yeah.
And he talks about actually the shame culture that we're in now is all about making sure people feel shamed by something they did or didn't do, or they misspoke, and because we live in a internet age, everything is kind of captured forever, and it's so you got these cricketers at the moment that aren't that are being told that they can't be in the cricket team anymore because of tweets that they sent when they were 16 or 18. Doesn't mean it's appropriate what they did, but we don't live in a world anymore that can hold that well and say that was then, and even them saying, I'm sorry, that was an idiotic thing for me to do at the age of 18. That's not enough. People still want their kind of pound of flesh, or whatever it is. And it's what's interesting about all these passages is that both the example around anger and the kind of things that you say to one another, and the example around reconciliation, are both familial, in the sense that they are both your brother. And I wonder if there's also an expectation there. This isn't just people that, someone cuts you up in traffic, although it's probably a good idea, probably not to swear at them either.
No,
but
exactly.
this is about what happens when familial relationships within the church.
Yeah, this is the rule of God for the people of God. This is for and the word brother and akim, it means brother and sister. It even means blended family, actually. But the idea is that it's like it isn't meant to be the rule of law for the whole country.
Okay.
It's not meant to be the thing that applies to everybody at all places and all times. It's like, if you call yourself a follower of me, this is how I want you to act.
Yeah.
And I think we lose sight of that a lot. So the people of God are the ones that are meant to be seeking this kind of ridiculous reconciliation. And I don't even know if it's possible to have forgiveness or reconciliation without relationship. Like, what are you reconciling? If there's no relationship, what are you reconciling? Right?
Yeah.
I do think there is a difference psychologically. There is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And I know Jesus is talking about them both happening here, but it is possible to forgive somebody and not be reconciled to them.
Yeah. I mean, just even the simple example of somebody who's now since died.
Yeah, exactly.
You can still.
Yeah.
Forgive.
And there are people, we have people in our lives. I have people in my life for whom forgiveness is something I have to have towards them, but they are still toxic people and I should not be in a relationship with them, right? But I need to not be calling them Raka in my heart.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then Jesus goes on, of course, to say, pray for your enemies.
Exactly.
So you aren't just left with forgiveness, but you're left with praying. And hopefully that in turn softens their hearts, that there may be a journey towards reconciliation.
But it is worth pointing out here. So this isn't a blanket statement of like, you must always reconcile to absolutely everybody at all the time. It's, you should reconcile to your brother and sister, right? Yeah. You see that, right? Like that's what's going on here. So it isn't a kind of a just go out into the world and get involved in all sorts of harebrained activities and just reconcile yourself to absolutely every enemy, even if you have no relationship with them. It's like, with your brother and your sister, those are the ones you are extravagantly seeking to reconcile with.
Yeah.
And if you are being pursued for reconciliation, then you need to recognize that as well.
Yeah.
And then right at the end, I mean, I know we're at the end, but I just want to point out that often a trick that modern day Christians do, because we're so addicted to this idea of private life and public life, that we say, oh, the Sermon on the Mount is just for your private inner life and it's not for your public world. I'd like to point out that that's ridiculous. I'm not going to use the word that I really think it is. Jesus brings up public attitudes and actions and institutions all the time. And here he does it. He's talking very specifically about the law courts and the public, apparatus, conflict resolution. And he's like, don't avail yourself of that.
Yeah.
Because that world it'll do to you what it does, right?
Yeah.
So he's very much recognizing that we are playing out our corporate existence, we're in a relationship existence as the kingdom of God, and we're doing it in a world that has other forms of life that do things differently.
Yeah.
And he's saying, I want you to publicly do something different. Yeah. So
we're going to close it there. Stephen, thank you so much. A lot to talk about, a lot to think about. I'm going to pray and then we'll be done for another week. Lord, we thank you for your words, deeply challenging. And I want to pray for anybody who's listening today, that for where the area of forgiveness and indeed reconciliation feels almost impossible, Lord, that you would enable them, equip them with all that they need by the power of your Spirit to live this out. We pray, Lord, for the softening of hearts, for all those listening and all those that they, as they listen, are thinking of. Equip us, Lord, for following you in the way of Jesus. Amen. Stephen, thank you for a great week.
Thanks, John. That was fun.
It was a lot of fun, and we'll see
Thanks
you next
for people
week.
sending in questions, and it was good.
Yeah, it's great. Keep the questions coming, and we'll be on live Zoom next week. Take care.
Go well. Bye.